Hello and welcome back to Brick System Brothers. A very deep topic to dive into today on the subject of Lego colors. I consider this to be an iceberg topic, which just means that there's a little bit that you can do to scratch the surface in terms of looking at what's out there right now, what most people are familiar with. And then under the water level, there's a huge body of information that just seems to continue to expand the more that you read into the various research that's been done and the things that are going on. And it just keeps on going. No matter how much you keep uncovering, there's always a little bit more to learn. So that's what I've kind of found over the past 5 years or so. And I'm going to cover a little bit of what I've been doing with Lego colors and what the community's been doing with Lego colors. And I think I want to start this video with this table right here. This is a WLWYB, We Love What You Build. It's kind of related to Lego, third-party display and that kind of thing. And this was one of their display pieces from 2021. It's actually the second version of a periodic Lego color table, and it got reviewed in several different websites. Brickset reviewed it, and a lot of the other smaller blogs have some write-ups. They're worth reading. Of the many links in the description, one or two of them will go to a review of this table. But this is probably what kicked off the discussion when I was in the right space to be looking at what people were doing with arranging Lego colors. And there have been other projects before this, but at that point I was not as interested in doing this kind of arranging and ordering. So those kind of flew over my radar. I wasn't really looking into what people were doing with color grids at that time. And this is the one that was kind of what kicked it off at about the same time I was getting into this idea of, how do you arrange Lego colors? How can we make a reference and find a balance between not too few and not too many? And something that you find when you start getting into Lego colors is there's really more than you think there are. So I wanted to start here with this table. I think there's 65 colors here. And to me, that is on the side of not enough information. It's lacking some of the things I would consider to be essential on a color chart. But just the same, it's kind of what got this started, and I wanted to start here. At the end of the day, I think this is more of a display piece than a reference reference material. It does a pretty good job of finding something in the middle of what people would be interested in. And so as a product, I think it does really well. But in terms of finding an orderly way to present the information, it does fall short on several fronts. And I'll let the reviews do the talking on that. But that's kind of where I wanted to get this started. If we jump back a couple of years, there are several noteworthy projects that were going on within the community in more of a individual front. And so individual collectors and AFOLs and fans were putting together their own charts. Here's one from Ryan Howarder, a well-known name when you start looking into Lego color information. A couple of the links are from those projects belonging to Ryan, and this chart is one of those from Flickr. So several colors here are arranged. You can see they're roughly grouped into solid, transparent, and then some of the effects, the chrome, pearl, and then as you kind of get to this right side of the chart, there's some really large one-off things. And for what a lot of people would like to be doing with color charts, I feel like this starts to get into the overboard side. But in pursuit of completeness, it's good to see these on here, and this just gives you a little better idea of what's actually out there compared to something like that would have more of a mass appeal. Going forward a little bit, there is a project from Jeremy Moody. I think this dates back to 2015. another one of the individual collectors that was working on having a color complete reference. This one, not as much in terms of the organization. There's a bit of a grid going on in the top half, especially looking at most of the representations being 2x4 in size, but then you run into the issue where a lot of the colors that you need for a complete chart were not actually produced in the 2x4 or something that could be added up into the 2x4 size. So there's a couple colors where there's only a 2x2 brick, or a few things that you can arrange to roughly form that outline. But then there's some other things like watering can and Duplo pieces that are just a little bit more of a sore thumb. And then of course those larger one-off bucket lids and base plates are really the only item we have to represent that color, but start to break that grid and break that structure if you're going to look at having things nicely uniform and try to get them laid out in any sense of a table. Here's just another similar one from Elspeth DeMontis. Found this on Flickr as well. There's actually a gallery of color charts, so I'll see if that can be one of the links in the description. This one, somewhat chromatic here. You can actually see similar colors where we had the cool yellow transition to bright light yellow, a lot of the shades of purple and blue. Some of those start to be very similar when you look at Azure and Marisk and those kind of colors, so that might give you a better idea of that chromatic progression. Significant differences, in some cases not so significant. But yeah, a lot of the newer stuff over here on the right would be the shimmering chrome colors. These are pretty recent, and then some of the satin opalescent colors as well within the last couple of years. So some good stuff from Elspeth. And then another Flickr reference here is the Coffee Mock. I included this one just to talk a little bit more about the arrangement in the column structure. I like this direction where we have defined columns across the top, and then there's a little bit of color blocking to go row by row to help break things up. But again, a somewhat chromatic arrangement of different color families. You have a pink, a green, a blue, kind of a purplish family that are all grouped together. This one has some labeling as well. Maybe not as complete in terms of having a representation of every color, but a nice look at what can be done with the structure and the grid approach. And of course, I will mention my current status of a color chart is nowhere near as complete, and I just recently started branching out from 2x4. So it's not really in the same league as some of those other charts, just looking at trying to have a representation of every color. But this was something that'd be going on about parallel to the time that the We Love What You Build periodic table came out, and that's kind of where things started to intersect in terms of what I'll be talking about next and going forward in the video. But this is an ongoing project that I've had. I've put out a couple of videos related to the chart. The first one in 2020 is really the introduction probably to when I started doing serious thinking about Lego colors. And one of the documents I'll show here pretty soon was going on within that 2020 timeframe. But first, I did want to go all the way back about 10 years to when I was sorting by color, and just mention this really briefly, that a lot of people do sort by color, and that's maybe one reason you'd want a color chart, is to have that reference. I think this works better for smaller collections, especially when you get to the point of you're trying to dig through all of these yellow pieces, or especially the darker colors, where you're losing a lot of that light. You're looking for a specific piece. A lot of times it's a smaller part and it's down in the bottom, and the bigger pieces are getting in the way. And so for a while, this was how I had my system set up. but at a certain point I did change over to sorting by part. And now what you can do is you can look through a bin of all the same type of part for a single color. It makes it a little bit faster to find what you're looking for. Even though the actual sorting process, you spend a little bit longer to get it set up like that, locating those pieces becomes less of a chore. So it is tempting to sort by color, even with a larger collection, because that actually makes the sorting process faster. It's a lot easier to pick out individual colors than individual pieces. But I think when you're looking at the other end, in terms of, when you actually want to go find that part, it's worth it to put in a little more time up front to be able to utilize that. It's easier to pick a color, you utilize that on the picking end. So that was about 10 years ago. I started switching to sorting by part. And then let's jump forward to 2020 and look at one of the first things I started thinking about when it comes to arranging Lego colors. I wrote up a document in LaTeX, and this was something that I was doing in one of my classes at the time. I wanted to do some practice with this and ended up deciding to focus on what I called the family theory project. So the first draft was January of 2020, and then I continued to refine it over that year. And basically what I ended up doing is narrowing it down into 6 main families, and then within each of those families I tried to have 10 to 15 individual colors that all had something in common within the family. And so the legacy family is a lot of the primaries, the grayscale, and some of those original colors that are probably among the most popular, that are produced in the highest volume. The transparent family, of course, would be the transparent colors. It's corresponding roughly to a lot of the colors in the legacy family. They're just the transparent variety. And then the other 4 are arguably pretty arbitrary, and this was something pretty early on in my project of deciding how I wanted to sort colors. And today I would consider this to be too reduced to capture everything, all the information that I want to have in a layout. But it is an important step in what I ended up with today and what's coming up, so I wanted to cover it. The natural family has mostly subdued colors. The sand colors belong here, and the darker ones as well. And so it's a good place to group things that you might see in mocks to help things be more natural, and a lot of those colors that aren't as bright and vibrant as the original primaries in Legacy. On the other hand, lucid colors are even more bright and vibrant than the primaries, and you see stuff like our vibrant coral, the bright light orange, and the bright light green, lime green, those kind of colors in here, where we're kind of across the other side and pushing into colors that are not as common in nature but are bright and fun. And then pastel colors are kind of the washed out tones, and the softer colors, a lot of the friend sets have these softer hues, the lighter blues and purples and pinks, and these can be useful to help tone things down as well and provide accents. And then the last category is the novel category, and this is where I tried to group a lot of the metallic effects, so pearl finishes, chrome finishes, metallic as well, where that's a drum lacquered effect. And then I went ahead and put a glow in the dark color in here for good measure, even though, as we'll see soon, there's actually been 3 distinct glow in the dark colors worth mentioning, and probably could even break that down arguably. But the last page of this document are some of the sources, and probably some of these links will be in the description, just in terms of where I started to gather information and do some reading on the Lego color Iceberg. So jumping back to personal project history, the next step here is from the color theory, the family theory document. Last year, in 2021, is when I started looking at periodic tables again, And like I mentioned at the start of the video, that display product was really what got me thinking about how do we take color information and put it in a useful grid, into a useful reference. So it ended up being a collaboration of the periodic table format, but then also looking at what I was doing with family groupings the year before. What I ended up building out of that was the first draft of this periodic table, and I started with 99 colors. So how this works is row by row kind of provides the base color, and you can see there's a mistake here with the light gray. This is supposed to be in one line, and that kind of pushed everything down, but it was after I'd saved it. I couldn't go back and fix it. It's unfortunate, but that's kind of what's going on row by row. And then the columns is where you start to see those families coming back in, although now they're much more distributed in terms of which are actually grouped together, trying to make that a little more sensible and a little more fixed in this grid. So the original columns had four main categories. We had the classic, transparent, mixed, and metallic, and that was a solid start. So my first periodic table draft looked like this, and then within the mixed column group, I did break it down a little bit further, looking at dark, medium, sand, and the bright light columns, where in a lot of cases these are the naming schemes used across most databases and most sources of information. Particularly our sand group here, pretty much everyone agrees on the four sand colors throughout the official LEGO database, Rebrickable, Bricklink. I guess enough was known at the time that those were kind of standardized that everyone could agree sand red is named as sand red just about everywhere. Some of the other ones, not so lucky. The older colors that LEGO didn't necessarily publish their official name for, that had been around, well, before they bought Bricklink, that was an independent site, and they needed a way to keep track of that color information as well. And so Bricklink kind of developed their own color standard over time, and then there were also kind of the popular community names for colors as well that people started knowing this color by. An example of that would be here in the bright light column on the orange row. Bright light orange is the official LEGO name, and for the most part a lot of these have been corrected across the other sources. But bright light orange, being involved with Hero Factory and Bionicle, also got a nickname, I think it's Keto Orange, from the community. And so for a while you could say Keto Orange and probably more people would know what color you're talking about, rather than if you had said bright light orange, because for a while I think that official LEGO name wasn't as known as some of those fan names. And so you have stuff like that have occurred for multiple colors across the board, and couple that with some of these colors that haven't really been used or have been retired, and there's just not as much initiative to get things consolidated. So when it comes to the actual names of the colors, that can be confusing, but the benefit of having things arranged in a grid like this kind of gives you a way to reference it without actually needing to know the color name. So this was last year. In October is when I actually put this on my Flickr, and then within the last couple months, one of the links down below is a Rebrickable article, and that has kind of kickstarted a recent dive back into the project with a 123 color version of that chart. Did a little bit of refining, a little bit of updating, and the current iteration of my version of the periodic table of colors for LEGO looks like this here. So as of March, middle of March here, I've got somewhat structured layout. I've done a little bit of changing around. Quite a few colors have been added in, but the basic structure of the periodic table is the same. I have 14 rows with the base color, and I actually didn't count here. We've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. I think there's 19 columns spread out with various different groupings. So to start with, I've got a baseline column, and what I wanted this to be is kind of a good reference for each color row as you go across. You kind of want something to base that off of. But this also is an opportunity to put in some of the most popular production colors all in one place and have a nice reference at the very beginning of the chart. And so this baseline row, I think these are all current production colors, and for the sake of having probably not this violet one, but just to have a start for the violet color, I put it over here. So that's kind of what the baseline starts out as, and then immediately I jump into 5 columns of transparent colors, and the common ones are right here in the middle. This is kind of what most people would have collected and use more often. Recently we've got this kind of satin version of a transparent brick. There's also the transparent glitter effect. There's a couple lighter shades of green and blue that are worth putting in the chart, even though it includes a mostly empty column. And then there are the neon transparent colors. And I'll come back to this red, this neon transparent red, but just keep that in mind for now. We've got kind of these 5 transparent groups. And then very similar to how I had originally laid out my table from last year, I moved back into the solid colors, and this time I'm going to label it with the hue families, and we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 hue families here. Instead of having the retired versions of the dark, light gray, and brown grouped next to their current colors like I did last year, I've actually moved those over into their own column and have that be a little more populated with some other colors like olive green and Marisk blue. So olive green isn't retired. Some of these other colors are. Just looking at what is similar about the colors in this column. They're kind of faded. They kind of almost have that natural appeal. And so kind of trying to find ways to group things that make sense and then fit those back into the row alignment where we have this progression of the grayscale through the chromatic and then the tan and brown at the bottom. So a lot of our nougat colors can fall into that pattern, and then there's also room to put the column of dark in again. The sand column, of course, can fit in, and similar as you move across, and then once again having this kind of washed out column at the end. The last 4 columns are what I'm calling the effect families. Once again, taking cues from last year's chart. I'm looking at pearl colors, the drum lacquered metallic finish, the chrome finish, and then some of the speckle colors. Can be argued whether or not to actually include those effects on a color chart. It just depends what you would find useful in having as a reference. But I think it does kind of fit up here, and possibly could use the space for something else like rubber. If you're separating your black rubber color from your black plastic, there's also a kind of white milky rubber color as well. But yeah, that really ends up being up to you or up to an individual person laying out a color chart. So yeah, chrome here, actually chrome is pretty much said and done in terms of what's being produced. I don't think Lego has put out a chrome finish part for several years now, but there are still a lot of places to get a hold of chrome silver and chrome gold. Those were relatively large volume parts compared to some of the other chromes in here. The chrome red was only used for a VIP minifigure keychain, and some places will not actually have a color ID. So going back to my neon transparent red, when it comes to Rebrickable's color database, they do not have a separate listing for the neon transparent red or the chrome red. And even though they do have a listing for that minifigure, they have not included a color code for that for some reason. And the parts that I would consider to be trans neon red have been included with transparent dark pink. just to point out an example of certain colors that might not be referenced everywhere. To round off this particular table, I did put a few more in the center top up here that don't necessarily correspond to a row or a column, but I wanted to include the original kind of milky white ABS plastic. So this would just be an uncolored plastic mold, and this particular piece here is a vintage part that was released in uncolored ABS. And then the three below that are the glow-in-the-dark colors, and you can still find reasonable quantities of all three. I think the current one is this solid white glow-in-the-dark that is still in production, but the other two are out there. So that's where I'm at with my periodic table project. What this does is it put things in a grid. What I don't like about this is all the empty space. There isn't necessarily as much logic in filling in gaps, but it does preserve the color group all the way through as you go row by row. And so if you know you're looking for a blue color, it's always going to be here in this blue row. It's just a matter of figuring out which family that's ended up in. And this is what I feel like is going to work good for me. And going forward, I've got a couple projects in mind where I'll be utilizing something where I actually map the Rebrickable ID onto this chart. So here would be my current version of this color map. It uses the Rebrickable IDs painted on to the reference here. Basically what I can do is, as I'm uploading pieces, if I grab, say, an olive green part, I can just reference this chart and know, hey, I need to put this 326 in for the color ID, and instead of looking it up in that table on Rebrickable, I'll just be able to have this chart open and rapidly pull those IDs. And like I mentioned, you can see I do not have the ID for this color, which actually isn't in the database, or the chrome red, which really only corresponds to one element that I don't have, so it probably doesn't need to be on here, but it does fit in the grid. And that kind of gets into something where, you know, at a certain point in this project, I was filling in colors just because they were out there to be found. And then I started thinking about, all right, well, if I'm using this for my projects and I know I'm not going to have these colors, and this started happening with things like clickets, where there's a lot of variations of a transparent color that weren't necessarily used for any bricks, but some of these one-off parts like the watch band straps, those links in the watches, or some more collectible or even Duplo, have a few exclusive colors that I don't see myself ever having in the collection and needing to record. And so that's where I start looking at which things I'm going to leave out of the chart, but also I want to have enough information here where I'm not frustrated that I have two different variations of a blue and I'm not able to distinguish that. So finding that balance is what it came down to for this specific iteration. This is the 123 color version, which I'll be testing out in the coming weeks as I work on my Rebrickable upload scheme and using this mapping. So that's kind of where I'm at with this project. Yeah, there's a lot of reading that you could do about Lego colors, and a lot of other people are way more interested in getting to the bottom of it than I am. Aside from actually having Lego release a comprehensive document or documentation about their process over the years, which I don't see as being a very likely event, even though they have been a lot more open within the past couple decades about how they keep track of this. Some of the stuff that you'll read is, concerning LDD. When that software was made available, there had to be a way for those colors to be organized within the software, and people can then go into that code and see how they had stuff named in there. So things like that have come out as Lego's been involved online and started publishing things is where we started to get more info, and then as well as those internal color palettes that you see pop up in their designer videos. if they didn't want us to see those, they really didn't want people to know how they have things organized, I think they definitely make more of an effort to have those completely omitted from designer videos. The fact that they're in there, even though they don't have a lot of featuring and they're not called out or anything, I think the fact that they're present, even if for just a second or two, that says that LEGO doesn't really mind us knowing how they operate things and what colors are current, and that kind of information, they're being a little more open with that, just by the nature of what they put online and what they publish. So there's that going on as well, but I think what I want to end up with is something functional that I can use for my purposes, which at the moment is mostly documentation and inventory purposes, where I'm not necessarily getting into all 180 something existing colors that we saw in the charts like this. I think this one has 182. So yeah, I don't necessarily need these duplo colors in my chart, but to know that they're out there, it's kind of fun to know there's stuff that probably hasn't been found yet, and a lot of the references that have been floating around actually refer to colors that we're not really sure what that specific number goes to. When you look at internal numbering schemes, there's gaps and things missing. So there's still a lot to learn and a lot to uncover, but I'm not necessarily waiting around until we have that information. I think what I've got organized here, what I've been iterating over the past couple of years, is going to get to a point where I'm happy with it and it's useful. And the display value here, I might look at something along the lines of mapping a periodic table layout like this to a color chart. For example, this guy. Yeah, I might try to take my 2x4 collection and related colors and rearrange that into some more ordered grid where it's actually on that layout. So that might be something going forward, but also just to have these numbers and these labels was what I was looking for as well. Getting that organized. Then you can start looking at, the first picture here. We'll go back. Some of the info that's included on here is actually fun to know as well. So the year of release, and you start looking at which colors are more popular and the color codes. That's all handy information that at some point I could figure out a way to incorporate in my personal periodic table of LEGO colors and have that be more of a display than a reference. So still more work to do. I think there's always room for improvement on these kind of projects, but I'm at a good point right now. I was thinking I'd like to share what I've been up to with this, probably where the color chart is going in the near future, and something that I've been working on aside from building mocks now that the workshop is not as accessible. So kind of turning my attention into the digital front and making progress there. Thanks for watching today, guys. Got more stuff coming, specifically related to helping fill out the color chart. Hopefully get that mentioned within the next couple videos. And yeah, new color coming into town. So we'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Brick System Brothers.